In London's West End, just north of the legendary Savile Row, you'll find the Mason's Arms. Originally built in 1721, it's been a popular destination for the cutters who have helped establish the Row's reputation for generations. It's also long been the meeting place for the 39 Club. My name's Mark Webster, and on behalf of the 39 Club, I'm in conversation with a celebrated tailor who helped introduce bespoke to a new generation, dressed everyone from Jay-Z to Tom Cruise. And it all started at the Milford Haven branch of Hepworth's. For our guest here today, Timothy Everest MBE, thank you very much for coming along and chatting to us. The Hepworth years, we need to deal with that. You were only a kid, weren't you?
I was very young, and thanks for having me, Mark. Yeah, I wanted to be a racing driver, and I'd flunked my education when I lived in Kent, and I did lots of different things. I actually got a job as a graphic designer, but didn't take that up because it wouldn't pay me enough petrol to put in my motorbike, which is kind of a clue, I think, of the headlines of all the chapters of our book. But I got a job with my uncle who worked for Hepworth, and we were the most westerly bastion of their empire because they were based in Leeds, which was somewhere I used to go and visit. And I didn't really want to go and work there. But the two things I was interested in were clothes, fashion really, and motorsport. And it gave me enough money to go karting and do things like that. But it was a great introduction into old-fashioned retail.
And it got you out there, didn't it? It got you involved. You know, you're a teenager, and suddenly now you're in a world of where you know you like clothes, but now you understand what clothes mean, don't you?
Yeah, it was a proper old-fashioned training. We used to have like a contact table years ago before it became Next, which is what Hepworth became. You had an arcade with a table there, and you'd have things like your tweed bunches. And the idea was if Mrs. Jones walked past and touched the bunch, you'd walk up and say, "Oh, that's a lovely tweed. Is Mr. Jones around on a Saturday?" And then working with my great uncle, you know, who was quite inappropriate, it was like carrying on tailoring. It was really funny. I remember the first day I was there, my immediate boss, Mr. John Kelly, was like Mr. Magoo. He was really short-sighted, so much so that I had to stop him giving the credit card and receipt to the mannequin on the left-hand side of the shop, and had to point out it was on the right-hand side. He said, "Of course it was, boy. Of course he's on the right-hand side." But it was lovely old schooling, and it was still, which was quite important for my later career, made to measure was still very important. It was all starting to become much more ready to wear. So the made to measure and going up to Leeds, being trained by the tailors there, and actually seeing how the workshops worked was something that I remembered and was very important for me maybe 10 years later.
Yeah, the formative years are great, and obviously they carry on through. But now, of course, we arrive at the important part. We're literally where we're sitting here in this old pub, the Mason's Arms, in which the 39 Club have their meetings. For centuries, it looked over that road where you ended up, which, of course, is now legendary from a wanted ad on the front of your book.
Yeah, well, Savile Row is somewhere I ended up by default. I was a club kid, so a lot of the people I met who used to come down to Wales who were very disappointed their parents couldn't pay for them to go to Spain or Portugal or Italy. They'd end up in Pembrokeshire, and then found us, and by that time we were running around a little club in near Saundersfoot and Tenby, and they used to invite us up to various places, like come up to Birmingham, there's a club called the Rum Runner, and you'd meet people like Duran Duran, and eventually we worked our way up to the Blitz Club and things like that. And it was peer pressure group, really. I was desperate to get a job up in London. I applied for 2 adverts that were in the Evening Standard, left over from a Friday when I was here on a Sunday after clubbing. One was for Bonsack bathroom fittings just around the corner on Mount Street, because I'd sold brass ornaments and lighting, and I thought, well, taps and things like that are quite similar, metal. I didn't get that. They said it was far too traumatic for a young man to come all the way from Wales. Lovely topped and bottomed type letter. And the other one was for Boy Wanted on Savile Row, which was kind of quite tempting. So I answered that advert and went and met Tommy Nutter on Savile Row.
Tommy Nutter, obviously instrumental, a catalyst in the story, but a catalyst for this world as well, because as we refer to it, Savile Row, centuries old, but Tommy Nutter was one of those guys that came in and gave it its rejuvenation, didn't he?
Well, when I went to meet Tommy, you couldn't research that because in those days you didn't have the internet. It was only sort of printed media and sort of word of mouth. So I put on my best suit, which wasn't probably the best suit that I had, because he sort of looked me up and down. I walked in a slightly disapproving way. And I remember him saying to me, "Do you know anything about me?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I know lots about you." And he said, "No, you don't know anything like that." So then he said, "Can I show you my portfolio?" And then, because I was actually looking for a job in fashion, I didn't really want to go to Savile Row because I thought it was old-fashioned. So I met this guy. He was pretty coolly dressed, and when he opened his portfolio, I remember it was on the floor. The first thing I saw was Abbey Road, and there's the Beatles, all lined up. And he pointed out that George Harrison was wearing denim. He was always a bit difficult, he said. And then there's pictures of Elton and so on. I thought, my God, I've met this fashionable tailor. I must come and work for him. So as I got to know him, I was very lucky. I pestered him for weeks. I used to ring up and they said, no, Mr. Nutter's in a meeting. No, Mr. Nutter's in Brighton. Mr. Nutter couldn't possibly take your call at the moment. And I used to go out. I remember my immediate boss, it was Mike Hughes by then, at Hepworth, didn't really want me to leave because I think I was reasonably good at my job and Hepworth wanted to promote me. But I used to go out with my 2p or whatever it was to the phone box, and every time I'd come back and he said, you didn't get the job yet. And anyhow, I got the job. But learning about him was very, very important to me.
What was the difference, or what could you bring from those teenage years at Hepworth and all the part of that trade you learned? Was stuff worth retaining, and what did you add to it in those early Savile Row years?
So, on reflection, I thought Hepworth was very boring, but we were the end of the high street. It was the beginning of the shopping centre. Yeah. So we were as important as the butcher, the baker, the bank manager. I can remember going to the bank manager and getting my first checkbook. And he said, try and keep in credit. We'll look after you. One day you might want to buy a house. And it was that old school approach. So when I was working with Hepworth, I was the relief manager for South West Wales, which was really looking after if anyone was off, I'd have to look after the shop. So then I saw the shops move from, say, the high street in Swansea to the shopping mall. So one of the reasons that was attracting me to Tommy Nutter is it was an independent retailer. And the skill set that I'd learned, which was old-fashioned retail, how to look after people, how to run basically a shop, I thought served me in good stead. So I'd gone from Little League to the Premiership with Tommy, which was quite a shock because it exposed me to a lot of things, particularly the clientele that I didn't expect to meet. But the thing I think you asked earlier that was very important, that Tommy was a breath of fresh air to the street. It had probably lost its way. It needed to be shaken up a bit, and he had a shop front which he was unusual, so glass floor to ceiling, whereas most of the shops had like modesty curtains, and you see people walk, looking over the curtains. I remember there used to be Cyril A. Castle, who was one of Cubby Broccoli's tailors and did dress Roger Moore, and you never see him as short man. You just see these eyes looking over the top. But Tommy, had a different look, and it was Michael Fish who actually convinced him of Mr. Fish, the shirt maker. I don't know if you remember, you will do the Italian Job when Simon D, I think, is pretending to be Michael Fish, with all the sort of matching sort of floral shirts. And Tommy was working for a tailor's in one of the arcades, Princess Arcade maybe, I can't remember the name. And he had a very good look, and he said to Michael, can I come and work for you? No, he said, why don't you do your own thing? So he was backed by Cilla Black, Peter Brown, who was managing the Beatles after Epstein died, and there was a lawyer, a barrister, I can't remember his name, and I think they all put £1,000 in and started in the late 60s. So having this sort of shop front, he then had amazing displays. So he worked with people like Simon Doonan, who went on to be the big creative director for Barney's in the sort of the great years in New York. And they had a very early punk rock window before punk rock. He had done these dustbins with rats with Diamante necklaces in the window. And I remember him saying that they were absolutely mortified, and he used to get told off because he was very young. They talked to him as if he was the boy. Like, now, Tommy, you really cannot be doing this. And then other stories of turning up for work. So I said, Tom, what was it like? He said, oh, it's just crazy. He said, I came to work one day, and John and Yoko are standing naked in the window. They've obviously turned up, know they're going to have a fitting, just taken off their clothes, and they're standing there. And I said to him, what was that like? And he said, well, why me? And he said, I nearly went home to have a cup of tea with my mum and sort of run away. But
how long was your, I guess, let's call it the apprenticeship, therefore, in Savile Row before you become you as such?
Well, I never planned to branch out on myself because I was quite happy being Tommy. I was very cheeky. I was working downstairs learning how to cut and sew, and I'd come up and leave sketches on his desk, and he'd say, who did that doll? And I said, I did. Well, just make the shoulders a bit broader and the jacket a little bit longer, and you can, do some designs. So we ended up working on things like Elton John's World Tour and Hankyu department store licensed agreement he had in Japan. So I've always felt that I'd like to do something. It's just that the environment was changing. The person who owned it wasn't a particularly nice person, and once I decided I didn't like him, then my days were kind of numbered. And then I decided that I wanted to learn a little bit more about retail, because designer brands were coming to the marketplace. And although Tommy was a fresh business on Savile Row and had a more contemporary take, generally it was seen as a negative place, long-winded, old-fashioned, and all those sort of things. So I was on the move.
You're on the move to the point where, and it's not too long later, I guess, London swings again becomes the phrase. And so there is a revolution again on Savile Row that you're in the middle of.
Yeah, so we went on to work for a retailer on Chiltern Street, where we are now, Malcolm Levine. And what was interesting there was I had an opportunity to reflect back on Savile Row in a positive way. So all the things that I thought were negative, we had to turn those into a positive. And working at Malcolm's, we had all the best sort of brands coming in. And a lot of people were consuming new brands like Prada. They were buying Armani. That sort of growth of those shops that were breaking out from, Browns on South Molton Street. They were having a much better experience because the brands were explaining what the looks were, whether it was in the magazine, whether it was in the window, whether it was the salesperson. And that didn't happen on Savile Row. And I just thought, well, this is really silly. Someone's not looking at British tailoring in a cool way. And we're not explaining it. That was the biggest thing. We're not telling people the difference between British tailoring and, say, Italian tailoring. And the combination of then now moving on to raving. I used to be in the East End quite a lot in the warehouse parties. I'd been to the Market Cafe for breakfast, which was open, reverse, because it was open 24 hours, wandering around. It was the first time I'd seen daylight, the houses around there. And I thought, these are brilliant. It'd be great to have a house of tailoring, but I couldn't afford to have one. Until I was introduced to a friend who's got an amazing hair salon called Fourth Floor on Northington Street, which has been moved there temporarily, probably nearly 30 years ago. And that was another important part of the building up of what was going to become Cool Britannia. I'd been in New York, and all the coolest places I'd been to were hidden. So all the bars and the clubs were hidden away. I remember going to the Gagosian Gallery, and that was really cool behind a door. And then also Richard Space. They'd moved from below Scott Crowler on Dover Street. They had the hair salon there. Then they were temporarily below Comme des Garçons and I think Brompton Cross. And they moved to the top floor of this warehouse. And it gave me the confidence that if I could find a space in Spitalfields, it didn't have to be in a normal place. And he introduced me to these guys who had a derelict house.
So there was a kind of gang, wasn't there? A group of young people that came along roughly the same time, but by coincidence or by design, for want of a better phrase, because of course you'll become sort of this kind of team that represented this Cool Britannia idea, didn't you?
Yeah, the gang of probably four. It was Oswald Boateng, Richard James, and probably Mark Powell was the start of that. We really got us on our way because we're in this derelict house. No one's going to come there, and I want to show people around, to see if I'm, to get feedback, see if I'm doing the right thing. And I met this very cool girl called Alison Hargreaves, who just started out on Hanbury Street, her own PR company. And I said, would you come round and have a look? And she, yeah, I said, I'll have a look. And she walked around with her hands in her pockets. And I thought, well, this is pretty cool, the strip paneling and sort of minimalist approach to tailoring. And she didn't say anything. And she stood outside the house and looked at it and she said, it's amazing. She said, but it makes absolutely no sense. She said, because a young guy, you're in an area that people aren't visiting for retail. You're in a dying trade. We'll have to create something. So that's where the new bespoke movement started, to answer your question. And she said, look, can you recommend anybody who's tailoring that's not on Savile Row? So I think we recommended Chris Rocco, who was up in Kentish Town. Georgina Godley, who'd been Crowler's partner, was doing some kind of sitting. Mark was going, so I recommended him. Then Oswald just about started on Vigo Street, and Richard left Browns and started on Savile Row. So initially it was a ragtag, a bunch of people. So every time we got a bit of press, whether it was the radio, TV or magazine, we were always in that article. Yeah. But we always had different people. And it was very smart, really, because as you said, just one person doesn't make much sense. If there's this idea of a movement, it'll get some kind of interest. And it did. I mean, we all ended up in Vanity Fair with Liam and Patsy on the front and Tony and Blair. And it was just quite bonkers. And the three of us on Savile Row. And it was an amazing moment. And interesting, a lot of, I think I've learned through the decade started actually the end of the 80s. Yeah. And a lot of what actually happened, I think that was mid-90s, was building up before that. And it was was quite an interesting moment when we felt we sort of peaked as a new bespoke movement.
Definitely. You mentioned Chiltern Street earlier. That's where you're at now. Tell me, what's the story about this kind of? It's a return, really, isn't it?
It is. I mean, everything we do is really by chance or by instinct. And as I said, I worked there for Malcolm. I wanted to build his business, but he didn't really want to do that. I didn't understand at the time. I just realised he'd lost one business. He didn't really want to have the risk of building his own brand. So that got me off to doing my business, which started off with styling, and then I was in, Spitalfields for 25 years. But pre-COVID, I got a phone call from Richard, and we were starting the business over again. And we were in a great location, number 1 Fashion Street. You couldn't make up the address, in a converted pub, which we put back to look like it was a converted pub. It was pretty run down when we first moved in. And I get a phone call from Richard Fromberg, which I've known him since 1986. I even ran into him on my honeymoon in New York, which my new bride thought was quite strange. I ran up Madison Avenue to tap this bald old man on the back to say hello. But he said, a mutual friend was saying, look, he's looking to retire. Would you take on the business? And I said, not at the moment. I've got too much to do with my own business. And they just said, just come over to Chiltern Street. Come on, it's a nice place. So I come over to Chiltern Street and see Richard, who I kept in touch over the years with pretty on a regular basis. And I was in the firehouse and Connie's Tasty Corner, where Bill Nye and other people go. And what was interesting, not only was there a nice atmosphere, but you saw people that I probably wouldn't see that regularly in East London there regularly. And obviously there's a lot of businesses around there, there's a lot of residences around there, so people consume and shop around there. And then COVID came along. I was in New York literally the week before it went completely manic. No one was talking about the virus. They were talking about Barney's closing, and I think it was like 40 units closed over 20 blocks, which was true. And no one was talking about COVID. So when COVID came along, I thought, well, we are knackered. What are we going to do? And maybe we'll have a better chance being on Chiltern Street than being on Fashion Street. And that was the decision to come back to Chiltern Street. And again, there was a logic. I'd worked next door, and bizarrely, we've ended up buying what was our competition in the 1980s. Yeah.
Is there anything specifically different that you can see in the way that you do your business, and indeed the way the business changed now that you're back at Chiltern Street?
It's really good timing to be back on Chiltern Street, because the wardrobe has changed, and COVID has really changed that a lot, particularly for the business community. So how we built Timothy Everest was actually modernising tailoring and the way we presented it. We weren't really doing anything different. We were just doing it differently. So the old skill set, but just whether it was the cut, the styling, to make it more modern. During COVID, it was basically people on Zoom calls, team calls, Netflix to the pub, and basically it became a sort of badge of honour. How badly dressed could you be when you went back to work? In fact, one of my friends, Jonathan, who modelled for us in a beautiful 3-piece suit for GQ years ago, was walking past literally a few months after COVID, wearing a holey cashmere jumper, T-shirt, really bad trainers, and a really bad tracksuit bottom. He thought it was really cool. So I dragged him in and put him in an alpaca jumper and some decent chinos. But what was happening is that people, when they came back to work or to start living their lives again, they wanted to be smarter, but they didn't really want to go back to being overly dressed up. So they associated a suit initially with being uncomfortable. So we were selling a lot of jackets and trousers that matched, which was quite funny. So I can wear that as a suit. Yes, you can wear it as a suit. But what we started to do was to put looks together. And then walking around the store, its heyday probably was the late 80s, mid-90s. And like a lot of these independent retailers, they kind of plateau. But it had this fantastic 80s vibe. In fact, we've kept the fixtures, which are actually being recreated because they're quite fashionable again. But walking around it, and particularly Richard's office with his Ron Arad desk and his Giaponti lamp, and I thought, this is really 80s. What film does it remind me of? And then Danny, my business partner, said it's 9.5 weeks. I said, no, it's not. It's American Gigolo. And it really kind of fitted in, because if you think about that sort of early Armani, that casual elegance, and grey flannel, we used to stock Armani, Stoline and CP. They always had a colourful, more relaxed approach to menswear, kind of fitted in with where we were going. We were developing what we call bespoke casual. So we were trying to look at more casual things, a bit like your chore jacket, but could we do it in a Huddersfield Fine Worcester?
Better one.
No, because the shape is very wearable, but you could luxe it up or casual it down. And that's what we started to do. So that's the change. So what's been really interesting, we put the tailoring room downstairs. We recreated one of the rooms from Spitalfields just to see if it worked, not to upset upstairs. And then we've evolved and improved, hopefully, the offer and the buy upstairs. And what's happening now, we're able to mix the two. So we can casualise downstairs, we can soften it with some knitwear and some of the casual shirtings and things from upstairs. And we can add formality to upstairs. And more now, bespoke has become not just a hand-tailored suit, it's more about a solution. We get a lot of people now where they want us to put a wardrobe together. So that is bespoke. It would be bespoke for you if you came in. Some of it might be handmade, some of it might be made to measure off the peg. It could be a triple mercerized T-shirt from Bergamo. It's sort of a combination of things to suit today's needs.
Well, so much of this and more is in your brilliant memoir, which each chapter is headed, and you touched this earlier, with interesting information about motorcars.
Well,
so is this still an obsession for you?
Yeah, I think as a family, my uncle had a garage, and that's why I moved back to Wales, because then I could go racing with them. So they've always been interested. My uncle raced all sorts of things: powerboats, karts, motorbikes was his big thing. But he had this thing called a Jangular, which was a Ford Angular that he kept sprinting, and eventually he bought a race 3.8 E-Type engine, which he put in this Angular with Formula 5000 wheels on the back, and it is an obsession. And there was no room for the cooling, so the radiator and cooling fan were in the boot with this pipe all the way through, this huge scoop on the top. There was a guy called Mick Bird who built the same thing, and he went racing with him, where Mick Bird would go flying around the track, and Andy, my uncle, every time he'd come to a corner, he'd go straight on at opposite lock. What he didn't realise, you can't stick an engine in an Angular, you have to have like a space frame. So the guy was racing his with an Angular, put on basically a racing car, and his was this thing pulling itself together. So there's always been an obsession, and as a business, we've worked a lot with wheels. I mean, we've done a lot with companies like Rolls-Royce, with Driving Jacket with Morgan Cars. We worked a lot with people like Rafa in cycling, Brooks, England, Pearson, the oldest bike shop in the world. I had a bicycle stolen and realised they'd just gone to the Guinness Book of Records, so we convinced them to rebrand and help them develop their shop in Sheen. And yes, we've got nothing special, but we've got a couple of old cars and an old scooter, which we still enjoy tinkering and driving.
Living the dream, Tim.
I hope so, especially being here.
Totally. Thank you so much.
Okay.